Hi, I'm Sarah. My husband's boss didn't just humiliate me, she tried to erase me from my own company. Victoria Sterling looked me dead in the eye at the company Christmas party and said, "You're just a secretary, honey. Leave the business and talk to the people who actually matter." She had no idea she was talking to the woman who owned 51% of the shares she was so proudly managing. But the silence didn't last long because at the next board meeting, she found herself sitting across from me, and I was the one holding the gavel. Before we dive in, tell me, have you ever been dismissed by someone who had no clue who they were really dealing with? Have you ever watched someone's face change when they realize their biggest mistake? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. The morning started like any other Tuesday in downtown Portland. I adjusted my blazer in the reflection of the glass doors at Sterling and Associates Corporate Solutions, a mid-sized consulting firm that specialized in helping struggling businesses restructure and find their footing. The building was one of those sleek, modern towers that screamed success, all steel and glass reaching toward the Oregon sky like a monument to ambition. I'd been walking through those doors every morning for 8 months now, carrying my leather portfolio and wearing the kind of professional smile that had gotten me through 2 tours in Afghanistan and 4 years of rebuilding my life afterward. The receptionist, Maya, always greeted me with genuine warmth. She was one of the few people in the building who treated me like I actually belonged there, rather than like I was some charity case filling a diversity quota. "Morning, Sarah. Coffee's fresh in the break room," she'd say, and I'd thank her before making my way to the elevator that would take me to the 15th floor, executive territory. My husband David worked on the 12th floor as a senior financial analyst. We'd made an agreement when I took this position. We'd keep our relationship professional during office hours. No lingering conversations by his desk, no intimate glances across the conference room, no obvious displays of coupledom that might make his colleagues uncomfortable. It seemed reasonable at the time. David had worked hard to build his reputation at Sterling and Associates, and the last thing either of us wanted was for people to think I'd gotten my job because of him. What they didn't know was that I hadn't gotten the job because of David at all. I'd gotten the job because I owned the company. Well, most of it anyway, 51% to be exact. A controlling interest that I'd purchased through a shell corporation 18 months earlier when Sterling and Associates was hemorrhaging money and on the verge of bankruptcy. The previous owner, an aging entrepreneur named Robert Kellerman, had been desperate to sell. I'd used my military disability benefits, some smart investments I'd made during my deployment, and a loan secured against property I'd inherited from my grandmother to put together the acquisition. The paperwork was handled through 3 different law firms, with the ownership trail deliberately obscured through a web of LLCs and holding companies. On paper, the majority shareholder was listed as Mountain West Investment Group, an entity that existed solely on legal documents and bank statements. It had been my financial advisor's idea, actually. Marcus Chen had been managing my money since I'd returned from overseas, and when I'd mentioned my interest in business acquisition, he'd suggested this particular approach. Sometimes, he'd told me, the best way to fix a broken system is to own it from the inside. But if you want to really understand what's wrong, you need to see how they treat people when they think those people don't matter. So that's exactly what I did. I took a position as executive assistant to the new CEO, Victoria Sterling, who'd been brought in by the board to turn the company around. On my resume, I was Sarah Martinez, military veteran with administrative experience and a bachelor's degree in business administration from Portland State. What I didn't mention was the MBA I'd completed online during my second deployment, or the fact that I'd been managing budgets and personnel logistics for units of over 200 soldiers before I'd turned 25. Victoria Sterling was everything I'd expected from her interview videos and corporate bio. Tall, blonde, perfectly polished in that way that spoke of private schools and family money. She wore power suits like armor and carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. She'd built her reputation by swooping into failing companies, cutting costs, streamlining operations, and delivering short-term profits that looked impressive on quarterly reports. What she was less known for was building sustainable long-term growth or treating employees like human beings rather than line items on a spreadsheet. From my desk outside her corner office, I had a front row seat to her management style. I watched her berate junior employees for minor mistakes, dismiss creative suggestions without consideration, and make decisions based solely on immediate financial impact rather than long term strategy. She had a particular talent for making people feel small. A raised eyebrow here, a dismissive comment there, a way of looking right through someone as if they didn't exist. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a woman who'd led reconnaissance missions in hostile territory, who'd made split second decisions that had saved lives, who'd earned a Bronze Star for actions under enemy fire, and I was being treated like I couldn't be trusted to organize a filing cabinet properly. But I absorbed it all. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every eye roll when I asked questions about company policy. I took detailed notes, not just of meetings and appointments, but of everything. Victoria's leadership decisions, her treatment of staff, her strategic choices, her communication with the board. I documented patterns of behavior that would have made any HR department cringe if Sterling and Associates had bothered to maintain a proper HR department. The other employees began to trust me in that way that support staff often become confidants. I was safe, just the assistant, someone who understood what it was like to be overlooked and undervalued. David's colleagues would stop by my desk to vent about unrealistic deadlines and impossible demands. The accounting team would share their frustrations about being asked to make numbers work that simply didn't add up. The junior consultants would quietly express their concerns about client recommendations that prioritized quick fixes over sustainable solutions. And through it all, I smiled and nodded and offered sympathetic ears, all while building a comprehensive picture of exactly how Victoria Sterling was running my company into the ground. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in November. Victoria had called a meeting with the board of directors, a monthly occurrence where she'd present her progress reports and strategic recommendations. As her assistant, I was responsible for preparing the presentation materials, coordinating the logistics, and taking minutes. I'd done this 8 times already, each meeting following the same basic script. Victoria would present impressive looking charts showing cost reductions and efficiency improvements. The board would ask a few perfunctory questions, and everyone would congratulate themselves on the company's apparent turnaround. But this time, I'd done some additional preparation. Using my access to company files and financial records, I'd run my own analysis of Sterling and Associates' actual performance under Victoria's leadership. What I found wasn't the success story she'd been presenting to the board. Yes, costs were down, but so was revenue. Client retention was at an all-time low. Employee turnover had increased by 40%. The short-term profits she was delivering were coming at the expense of everything that made the company valuable in the long run. I'd prepared 2 sets of presentation materials that day. The first was Victoria's standard dog and pony show, full of cherry-picked metrics and optimistic projections. The second was my own analysis, complete with comprehensive data, client feedback surveys, and employee satisfaction reports that painted a very different picture of the company's trajectory. I had no intention of using the second presentation that day. I was still gathering information, still building my case, still waiting for the right moment to reveal my true position. But sometimes the moment chooses you rather than the other way around. The meeting started exactly as I'd expected. Victoria strode into the boardroom at precisely 2 o'clock, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor with the kind of authority that announced her presence before she even spoke. She wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun that made her look like she was preparing for battle rather than a routine board presentation. I followed behind her, carrying the leather portfolio containing her materials, my notepad, and the backup presentation I'd prepared but had no plans to use. The boardroom was one of those spaces designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River, a conference table that could seat 20 people comfortably, and abstract art that probably represented someone's idea of corporate sophistication. The board members were already seated, 7 individuals who collectively represented decades of business experience and millions of dollars in combined net worth. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, not the senator, but a retired economics professor who'd served on corporate boards for over 20 years, sat at the far end of the table, reviewing quarterly reports through reading glasses that made her look perpetually skeptical. Next to her was James Rodriguez, a former tech executive who'd sold his startup to Microsoft in the 90s and had been living off strategic investments ever since. Margaret Chen, Marcus's aunt, though I'd never mentioned that connection to anyone at Sterling and Associates, occupied the seat closest to the window, her silver hair catching the afternoon light as she studied her tablet with the kind of focus that had made her one of Portland's most successful real estate developers. The other board members included Robert Fisher, a semi-retired attorney who specialized in corporate law, Dr. Amanda Cole, who'd built and sold three successful healthcare companies before turning 50, Thomas Williams, whose family had owned lumber mills in Oregon for 4 generations, and Sandra Park, the youngest member of the board at 42, who'd made her fortune in sustainable energy consulting. Victoria took her position at the head of the table, connecting her laptop to the projection system with practiced efficiency. I settled into the chair along the wall that was designated for support staff, close enough to take accurate notes, far enough away to remain invisible unless specifically needed. It was a position I'd grown accustomed to, this careful balance between presence and invisibility. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria began, her voice carrying that particular tone of confident authority that had probably served her well in boardrooms across the country. I'm pleased to report that Sterling and Associates continues to exceed expectations across all key performance indicators. The first slide appeared on the screen, a graph showing reduced operational costs over the past 8 months. The numbers were accurate, but they only told part of the story. What the graph didn't show was that those cost reductions had come primarily from cutting employee benefits, eliminating professional development programs, and reducing the quality of client deliverables to increase profit margins. Victoria clicked to the next slide, which displayed client satisfaction scores that looked impressively high. I knew from my own research that these scores had been calculated using a modified survey methodology that eliminated negative responses as outliers and focused only on clients who had completed projects within the last 60 days. Clients who had terminated their contracts early, and there had been several, weren't included in the data at all. As Victoria continued her presentation, I found myself taking two sets of notes. The first was the official meeting minutes that would be distributed to the board members and filed in company records. The second was my own commentary, documenting the gaps between what Victoria was presenting and what the data actually showed. Employee productivity has increased by 15%, Victoria announced, advancing to a slide that showed impressive-looking charts and graphs. This improvement reflects our commitment to operational efficiency and performance-based management. Dr. Warren looked up from her papers. What metrics are you using to measure productivity? We're tracking project completion times, billable hours per employee, and client deliverable turnaround, Victoria replied smoothly. All three categories show consistent improvement since the implementation of our new performance standards. What Victoria didn't mention was that project completion times had improved primarily because the company was taking on smaller, less complex projects that required fewer resources but also generated lower revenue. Billable hours per employee had increased because overtime had become mandatory for most staff, with no corresponding increase in compensation. And client deliverable turnaround had improved because the quality standards had been lowered to prioritize speed over thoroughness. James Rodriguez leaned forward. How are we performing relative to our competitors in terms of client retention? Victoria's smile never wavered, but I noticed the slightest hesitation before she answered. Client retention remains strong, with most of our departures reflecting natural project completion cycles rather than dissatisfaction with our services. I knew this was a carefully worded non-answer. Client retention had actually dropped by 28%, but Victoria was technically correct that most departures were linked to project completion because clients were choosing not to renew contracts or engage Sterling and Associates for additional work. Margaret Chen, who had been quietly reviewing documents throughout the presentation, looked up with the kind of expression that suggested she was asking questions Victoria might not want to answer. I'd like to see a breakdown of revenue by client category. Are we maintaining our relationships with long-term institutional clients, or are we increasingly dependent on short-term project work? This was exactly the kind of question I'd been hoping someone would ask. The revenue breakdown would reveal that Sterling and Associates was losing its established client base and replacing steady, ongoing relationships with smaller, one-time projects that generated less profit and offered no long-term stability. Victoria's presentation style shifted almost imperceptibly. Her gestures became slightly more animated. Her voice took on a tone of enthusiastic confidence that felt just a little too polished. Our client portfolio reflects a strategic diversification that positions us for growth across multiple market segments. We're building relationships with emerging companies while maintaining our commitment to established institutional partners. It was corporate speak at its finest, on a response that sounded substantive but contained no actual information. I'd heard Victoria use similar language in client meetings when she was trying to deflect difficult questions or mask problems she didn't want to address directly. Dr. Cole, who had been listening silently while making notes on her tablet, spoke up. What's our current employee turnover rate, and how does that compare to industry standards? The question hit like a stone dropped into still water. Victoria's pause was brief but noticeable. Employee turnover has been within acceptable parameters for a company undergoing operational transformation. We've implemented robust hiring processes to ensure that new team members align with our performance-oriented culture. Thomas Williams, whose family business experience had taught him to read between the lines of corporate presentations, pressed further. Could you give us specific numbers? What's the actual turnover percentage? Victoria's smile remained in place, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. I don't have those exact figures with me today, but I can provide a detailed breakdown in our next quarterly report. It was a deflection, and everyone in the room knew it. Employee turnover data was basic information that any CEO should have readily available, especially when discussing operational efficiency and performance improvements. The fact that Victoria was avoiding the question suggested she knew the numbers weren't flattering. The question caught me completely off guard. Board members rarely addressed support staff directly during formal presentations, and certainly not to request specific data that might contradict the CEO's narrative. I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me, including Victoria's, whose expression had shifted from confident authority to something that looked dangerously close to warning. I had the data Sandra was asking for. I'd compiled comprehensive HR statistics as part of my own analysis, and the numbers painted a picture that was dramatically different from the success story Victoria had been presenting. Employee turnover was running at 47% annually, nearly double the industry average. Exit interviews consistently cited poor management, unrealistic expectations, and lack of growth opportunities as primary reasons for departure. But I also knew that providing this information would be stepping far outside my role as executive assistant. It would be directly contradicting my boss in front of the board using data I'd compiled independently rather than information Victoria had authorized me to share. It would be, in corporate terms, an act of insubordination that could justify immediate termination. I looked at Victoria, whose eyes held a clear message: stay in your lane. Then I looked at Sandra Park, whose expression suggested she suspected there was more to the story than what they'd been hearing. And in that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I cleared my throat softly, feeling the weight of 7 pairs of eyes focused on me. The boardroom suddenly felt smaller, the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows creating shadows that seemed to shift and dance across the polished table. My heart was beating steadily, not with nervousness, but with the kind of controlled awareness I'd learned during my military service, when split-second decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. I do have access to some HR metrics, I said carefully, my voice steady and professional. The current annual turnover rate is approximately 47%. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's pen stopped moving across her notepad. James Rodriguez raised his eyebrows. Margaret Chen leaned forward slightly, her business instincts clearly sensing that this number was significantly higher than what they'd been led to expect. Dr. Warren was the first to break the silence. 47%? That's considerably above industry standards for consulting firms, isn't it? Before I could respond, Victoria's voice cut through the room like a blade. Sarah, I think there may be some confusion in your calculations. We haven't completed our annual HR audit yet, So those numbers are preliminary and likely inaccurate. I felt the familiar sensation of being dismissed, of having my competence questioned in front of people whose opinions mattered. It was the same feeling I'd experienced countless times over the past 8 months. The subtle but unmistakable message that I was just support staff, that my observations and insights were irrelevant, that I should smile and nod and stay quietly in my designated corner. But this time was different. This time, I had information they needed, and I had the authority to share it, even if they didn't know that yet. Actually, I said, keeping my voice level and professional. I pulled those numbers from the official HR database this morning. They reflect completed exit interviews and documented departures through October 31st, so they're quite current. Victoria's eyes flashed with something between anger and panic. Sarah, I don't think this is the appropriate forum for. No, this is exactly the appropriate forum, Sandra Park interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from running her own company for over 15 years. If we're evaluating operational efficiency and performance metrics, employee retention is absolutely relevant data. Thomas Williams nodded in agreement. 47% turnover is a red flag for any organization. It suggests serious problems with management, workplace culture, or both. Dr. Cole was already pulling up information on her tablet. Industry standard for consulting firms is typically between 15 and 25% annually. If we're running at 47%, we're hemorrhaging talent and institutional knowledge. I watched Victoria's carefully constructed presentation beginning to unravel in real time. Her PowerPoint slides full of optimistic projections and selective metrics suddenly looked less impressive when viewed against the reality of massive employee turnover. The cost savings she'd been celebrating were starting to look like the symptoms of a company in crisis, rather than evidence of successful leadership. Perhaps we should table this discussion until Victoria can provide comprehensive HR analytics, Robert Fisher suggested, his legal training making him instinctively cautious about making decisions based on incomplete information. But Sandra Park wasn't ready to let the topic go. Actually, I'd like to understand what's driving these departures. Sarah, do you have access to exit interview data? This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since I'd started working at Sterling and Associates. I had access to far more than exit interview data. I had comprehensive analysis of employee satisfaction surveys, client feedback reports, financial performance metrics, and operational efficiency studies that painted a detailed picture of exactly how Victoria Sterling was managing my company. I do, I said, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. Would you like me to summarize the primary reasons employees have cited for leaving? Victoria's voice was sharp with barely controlled anger. Sarah, you're overstepping your. Let her speak, Margaret Chen said firmly. If we have an employee retention crisis, we need to understand what's causing it. I opened my notepad, though I didn't really need to refer to my notes. I'd been documenting these patterns for months, watching talented people walk away from what should have been a stable, rewarding workplace because they couldn't tolerate the toxic environment that had developed under Victoria's leadership. The most frequently cited reasons include lack of professional development opportunities, unrealistic workload expectations, insufficient compensation for overtime requirements, and poor communication from management, I began. Several departing employees specifically mentioned feeling undervalued and micromanaged. Others cited concerns about declining work quality due to impossible deadlines. James Rodriguez was taking notes now. These are classic symptoms of management problems, not operational efficiency improvements. Dr. Warren looked directly at Victoria. How do you respond to these concerns? Victoria's composure was starting to crack. The confident, authoritative CEO who had walked into the boardroom an hour earlier was being replaced by someone who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Every organization experiences growing pains during periods of transformation, she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. Change management inevitably creates some temporary challenges, but the long-term benefits of our operational improvements will. Temporary challenges that last 8 months aren't temporary, Sandra Park interrupted. They're systemic problems. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. What had started as Victoria's routine quarterly presentation had become an impromptu performance review, with the board asking the kinds of probing questions that suggested they were starting to doubt the narrative they'd been accepting for months. And I was no longer just the silent note taker in the corner. Somehow, I'd become a source of information that was contradicting the official story, providing data that revealed the gap between Victoria's presentations and the company's actual performance. Margaret Chen turned toward me again. Sarah, in your role as executive assistant, you probably have insight into daily operations that might not be reflected in quarterly reports. What's your assessment of employee morale? It was an extraordinary question. A board member asking for strategic input from someone who was supposedly just administrative support. But Margaret Chen hadn't built a successful real estate empire by ignoring valuable information, regardless of its source. And I thought about the conversations I'd had with David's colleagues, the frustration I'd witnessed in accounting meetings, the resignation letters I'd typed for people who had once loved their jobs. I thought about Maya at the reception desk, who'd started looking for other opportunities because she couldn't afford to live on her current salary. I thought about the junior consultants who'd stopped suggesting innovative solutions because they'd learned that creativity wasn't valued under the current management structure. Employee morale is at the lowest point I've observed since starting here, and I said honestly. People are working longer hours for the same compensation, taking on additional responsibilities without recognition, and watching colleagues leave without being replaced. Why? Victoria's face had gone pale. Sarah, I think you're making judgments that are outside your area of expertise. Actually, Dr. Cole interrupted. Employee satisfaction is directly within her area of observation. As executive assistant, she interfaces with staff across all departments. Her perspective is probably more comprehensive than anyone else's in the organization. Thomas Williams was nodding slowly. In family business, we learned early that the people closest to daily operations often have the clearest view of what's actually happening. Management can get isolated in executive suites and miss important signals from the workforce. Robert Fisher looked up from his legal pad. Victoria, do you have employee satisfaction surveys or formal feedback mechanisms that might provide additional data on these concerns? The question hit its target. Sterling and Associates had conducted employee satisfaction surveys regularly under previous management, but Victoria had discontinued them 6 months earlier, claiming they were an unnecessary expense that diverted resources from revenue-generating activities. We've streamlined our feedback processes to focus on performance-based metrics rather than subjective satisfaction measures, Victoria said. But her answer sounded weak even to her own ears. Sandra Park's expression suggested she recognized corporate doublespeak when she heard it. So you eliminated employee feedback surveys? We reallocated those resources to more productive applications. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt charged with disapproval. Board members exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to see a pattern of decision-making that prioritized appearance over substance, short-term gains over long-term stability. And I realized that I was no longer just observing this meeting. I was actively influencing its direction. My responses were providing the board with information they needed to make informed decisions about the company's leadership and strategic direction. For the first time in 8 months, I felt like I was doing the job I'd actually been hired to do. The meeting continued for another 47 minutes, but the tone had fundamentally changed. What had begun as Victoria's carefully orchestrated presentation of selective achievements had transformed into something that felt more like an investigation. Board members were asking follow-up questions, requesting specific data, and expressing concerns about discrepancies between the official narrative and the information I'd provided. Dr. Warren requested a comprehensive employee retention analysis to be completed within 2 weeks. James Rodriguez asked for detailed breakdowns of client satisfaction metrics, including data from terminated contracts. Margaret Chen wanted to see comparative industry benchmarks for all performance indicators. Sandra Park insisted on exit interview summaries from the past 6 months. Victoria agreed to everything with the kind of forced enthusiasm that barely concealed mounting panic. As the board members filed out of the conference room, discussing among themselves in the hushed tones that suggested serious concern, I began gathering the presentation materials and cleaning up the scattered papers and coffee cups that always accumulated during long meetings. Victoria waited until the room was empty except for the two of us before she spoke. Sarah. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the underlying fury like electricity humming through power lines. I need to see you in my office. Now. I followed her down the hallway, past the cubicles where junior staff members were wrapping up their afternoon work, past the break room where someone had left the coffee pot on too long, and the smell of burnt caffeine hung in the air like a warning. Victoria's corner office was everything you'd expect from a CEO who cared about appearances: leather furniture, expensive artwork, floor to ceiling windows with a view that showcased Portland's skyline like a personal achievement. She closed the door behind us with more force than necessary, then turned to face me with an expression that would have been intimidating if I hadn't spent 2 years dealing with hostile combatants in Afghanistan. What the hell do you think you're doing? She demanded, her professional veneer finally cracking to reveal the anger that had been building throughout the board meeting. I set my notepad on the chair beside her desk and met her gaze directly. I was answering the questions the board members asked me. You were undermining my presentation with unauthorized data analysis, she snapped. You're an executive assistant, not a strategic consultant. Your job is to take notes and organize my calendar, not to provide commentary on company performance. The dismissal in her voice was familiar, but this time it felt different. This time, I wasn't just the overlooked support staff member absorbing condescension in silence. I was the majority shareholder watching an employee question my authority in my own company. The board asked for specific information, I said calmly. I provided accurate data from official company records. Accurate data that you had no business compiling in the first place, Victoria shot back. HR metrics aren't part of your job responsibilities. You accessed confidential information without authorization and shared it in a way that was designed to make me look incompetent. I felt something shift inside me, like a gear clicking into place. I accessed information that's relevant to the company's performance, information that the board needs to make informed decisions about strategic direction. Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. Strategic direction? You're a secretary, Sarah. You answer phones and schedule meetings. Strategic direction is handled by people with MBAs and executive experience, not by whatever online business courses you might have taken between filing and making coffee. The words hit exactly where they were intended to, the same place every dismissive comment and condescending assumption had been aimed for the past 8 months. The implication that my military service was irrelevant, that my education was somehow inferior, that my role in the company was fundamentally insignificant. But instead of the familiar sting of being undervalued, I felt something else entirely. I felt the quiet satisfaction of watching someone dig their own grave with remarkable efficiency. You're right, I said, my voice steady. I am just the secretary, someone who answers phones and schedules meetings and has access to all the information that flows through this office. Victoria's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? I walked over to the window, looking out at the Portland skyline that stretched toward the mountains in the distance. The afternoon light was starting to fade, casting long shadows across the city I'd called home since returning from my second deployment. It was a view I'd been looking at for 8 months, but today it felt different. Today, it felt like mine. It means I've had 8 months to observe how this company operates under your leadership, I said, turning back to face her. 8 months to document patterns of decision-making, employee treatment, and strategic choices. 8 months to compile comprehensive data on everything from client satisfaction to operational efficiency. Are you threatening me? Victoria's voice had gone dangerously quiet. I'm stating facts, I replied. Facts that the board is clearly interested in reviewing. Victoria moved behind her desk, putting the large piece of mahogany furniture between us like a barrier. Let me be very clear about something, Sarah. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but this is my company. I run Sterling and Associates, and I make the decisions about personnel, strategy, and operations. Your little performance in that boardroom today was completely inappropriate. And if you think, your company? I interrupted, my voice still calm but carrying a new edge. That's interesting. Something in my tone must have caught her attention because she stopped mid-sentence. her eyes studying my face with a kind of intensity that suggested she was trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't known existed. What do you mean by that? She asked carefully. I moved back toward her desk, my movements deliberate and controlled. I mean that ownership and management are two different things, Victoria. You manage Sterling and Associates, but you don't own it. The ownership structure is handled by the board and shareholders, she said, but there was uncertainty creeping into her voice. That's not relevant to your position here. Actually, it's extremely relevant to my position here, I said, reaching into my portfolio and pulling out a manila folder I'd been carrying for 8 months, but had never opened in front of anyone at the company. Because while you've been managing this company, I've been watching you run it into the ground. Victoria's face had gone pale. What are you talking about? I opened the folder and removed a single document, a stock certificate issued by Mountain West Investment Group, showing ownership of 51% of Sterling and Associates Corporate Solutions. At the bottom, in neat black ink, was my signature. Not the Sarah Martinez signature I'd been using as executive assistant, but my full legal name, Sarah Elena Martinez Kellerman. Victoria stared at the document for a long moment, her eyes moving across the legal text and corporate seals as if she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. This is impossible, she whispered. Mountain West Investment Group, I said, setting the certificate on her desk where she could examine it more closely. The shell corporation that purchased 51% of this company 18 months ago when Robert Kellerman was facing bankruptcy, the entity that's been listed as majority shareholder in every quarterly report you've filed with the board. Victoria picked up the certificate with trembling hands, studying the signatures and official seals that verified its authenticity. You're, you own, I own 51% of Sterling and Associates, I confirmed. Which means that while you've been treating me like irrelevant support staff, you've actually been working for me. The silence that followed was profound. Victoria sat down heavily in her executive chair, still holding the stock certificate like it might disappear if she let go of it. Her face had gone from pale to ashen, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to reconcile everything she thought she knew about the company's ownership structure with the reality that was sitting on her desk. Why? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why take a job as executive assistant if you own the company? I pulled out the chair across from her desk and sat down, feeling for the first time in 8 months like I belonged in this office. Because I wanted to understand exactly how you were running my investment, I said. And now I do. Victoria stared at the stock certificate for what felt like an eternity, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing the edges of the document as if she could somehow make it disappear through sheer force of will. The afternoon sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long shadows across her office that seemed to emphasize the gravity of what was happening between us. This doesn't make sense, she said finally, her voice hollow. If you owned the company, why would you let me treat you like... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Like I didn't matter, I suggested. Like I was just another piece of office equipment to be managed and dismissed. Victoria flinched at the words, but she didn't deny them. I need to call the board. I need to verify this. There has to be some mistake, some misunderstanding about the ownership structure. Go ahead, I said, settling back in my chair. Call Margaret Chen first. Ask her about Mountain West Investment Group's acquisition 18 months ago. Ask her who she's been filing quarterly reports to. Ask her who signed off on your employment contract. Victoria reached for her phone, then stopped, her hand hovering over the receiver. The implications were starting to sink in, and I could see the realization dawning in her eyes like a slow-motion catastrophe. You've been documenting everything, she said, and it wasn't a question. Everything, I confirmed. Every meeting, every decision, every interaction with employees and clients, 8 months of comprehensive performance evaluation from someone who had complete access to all company operations. She put her head in her hands, and for the first time since I'd known her, Victoria Sterling looked genuinely vulnerable. Not the carefully constructed vulnerability she'd sometimes display in client meetings when she wanted to appear approachable, but the real thing, raw and unguarded and completely authentic. The board meeting today, she said without looking up. You planned that. You knew exactly what questions would be asked, what data would be requested. I didn't plan anything, I said honestly. I prepared for the possibility that someone might ask difficult questions, but I couldn't have predicted how that meeting would unfold. Sandra Park's questions were her own initiative. Victoria raised her head, studying my face as if she was seeing me clearly for the first time. But you were ready with answers, specific numbers, detailed analysis. You weren't just responding spontaneously. I nodded. I've been ready for 8 months. Every day I've been watching you make decisions that prioritize short term appearances over long term sustainability. Every day I've been documenting choices that save money in the quarterly reports while destroying the company's foundation. And you never said anything. You never tried to guide me toward better decisions. You just watched me fail. There was something almost plaintive in her voice, like a student realizing they'd been taking the wrong exam all semester. But I'd learned in the military that leadership wasn't about preventing people from making mistakes. It was about creating environments where good decisions were more likely than bad ones. I tried, I said quietly. I suggested alternative approaches to cost reduction that wouldn't require eliminating employee benefits. I provided research on client retention strategies that focused on relationship building rather than project completion speed. I drafted memos about the correlation between employee satisfaction and productivity. You dismissed all of it as irrelevant input from administrative staff. Victoria's face crumpled slightly. I don't remember. You wouldn't, I said, not unkindly. Because it came from me, and I was just the secretary. My observations didn't matter because my position didn't matter. My insights were irrelevant because my title was irrelevant. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the heating system and the distant sound of traffic 15 floors below. Victoria sat motionless, still holding the stock certificate, while I watched her process the full scope of what had been happening for the past 8 months. What happens now? She asked finally. It was the question I'd been expecting, but I still took a moment to consider my answer carefully. I'd spent 8 months observing Victoria's leadership style, documenting her decision making patterns, and evaluating her impact on the company's long term viability. The data was clear. She was failing as a CEO, not through incompetence or malice, but through a fundamental misunderstanding of what successful leadership required. That depends, I said. On what? On whether you're capable of learning from this experience, or whether you're going to double down on the same approaches that have been driving this company toward another bankruptcy. Victoria's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. Are you firing me? I'm giving you a choice, I said. You can acknowledge that your current management strategy isn't working and accept guidance from someone who understands both business operations and employee motivation. Or you can continue believing that you know best, in which case I'll exercise my authority as majority shareholder to make necessary changes in company leadership. She was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the Portland skyline as the afternoon light continued to fade. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I thought I was doing a good job. The numbers looked good. The board seemed satisfied. The quarterly reports showed improvement across all the metrics that matter. The metrics that matter to whom? I asked. To shareholders looking for quick returns? To board members who only see summary reports every 3 months? Or to the people who actually make this company function day after day? Victoria turned back toward me, and I saw something I hadn't expected in her expression: genuine confusion. I don't understand the distinction. And that was the moment I realized Victoria wasn't failing because she was incompetent or deliberately destructive. She was failing because she'd been taught a version of business leadership that treated human resources as interchangeable components rather than as the foundation of sustainable success. Tell me about your background, I said. How did you learn to run companies? She seemed surprised by the question, but after a moment she began to speak. MBA from Wharton, specializing in organizational restructuring and turnaround management. I've consulted with companies in crisis for 12 years, helping them streamline operations and return to profitability. My track record shows consistent success in reducing costs and improving quarterly performance. How long do you typically work with a company? I asked. Usually 18 to 24 months, long enough to implement necessary changes and demonstrate improved performance. Then I transition to the next project. I nodded slowly, understanding now why Victoria's approach had been so destructive to Sterling and Associates' long-term prospects. So, you've never stayed with a company long enough to see the long-term consequences of your restructuring decisions. The long-term consequences are improved profitability and operational efficiency, she said, but there was less certainty in her voice than there had been an hour earlier. For some companies, maybe, I agreed. But what about the companies where employee turnover continues to increase after you leave? What about the ones where client relationships deteriorate once the focus shifts from quality to speed? What about the organizations that show improved quarterly numbers for 2 years and then collapse because they've lost their institutional knowledge and competitive advantages? Victoria was quiet again, and I could see her turning over questions she'd apparently never considered before. I never followed up, she finally admitted. Once a project was completed and the performance metrics showed improvement, I moved on to the next challenge. Which means you've been optimizing for short term success without understanding the long term impact of your strategies, I said. You've been treating symptoms without diagnosing underlying causes. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd revealed my ownership of the company, Victoria looked like she was genuinely listening rather than simply reacting. So, what would you do differently? She asked. And that was when I knew she might actually be capable of change. I leaned forward in my chair, recognizing the opportunity that Victoria's question represented. For 8 months, I'd been watching her make decisions without understanding their broader implications. Now, for the first time, she was asking for input rather than dismissing it. First, Akdit, I said, we need to understand why Sterling and Associates was failing before you arrived. Robert Kellerman wasn't incompetent. He'd built a successful consulting firm over 15 years, but he made critical errors in the final 2 years that nearly destroyed everything he'd created. Victoria set the stock certificate on her desk and gave me her full attention. What kind of errors? He expanded too quickly without adequate capital reserves. He took on clients that were outside the company's core competencies because they offered higher fees. He hired expensive senior consultants, but didn't invest in developing junior staff, which created an unsustainable cost structure and limited growth potential. I walked over to her whiteboard and picked up a marker, drawing a simple diagram that showed the relationship between client satisfaction, employee retention, and long-term profitability. Kellerman's mistakes were strategic, but they weren't cultural, I continued. His employees were loyal, his clients trusted the quality of his work, and his reputation in the industry was solid. When financial pressures mounted, he could have addressed the strategic issues while preserving the cultural assets that made the company valuable. Victoria studied the diagram, but instead he sold the company. He sold it because he panicked. He saw declining profits and assumed the entire business model was flawed, rather than recognizing that he'd made specific strategic mistakes that could be corrected. I drew another diagram showing how her cost-cutting measures had affected different aspects of the company's operations. Your approach has been to treat the symptoms of financial distress without addressing the underlying strategic issues. You've reduced costs by eliminating the very things that made Sterling and Associates competitive in the first place, such as professional development programs that kept employees current with industry trends, quality control processes that ensured client deliverables exceeded expectations, relationship building activities that turned one-time projects into long-term partnerships, competitive compensation packages that attracted and retained top talent. Victoria was taking notes now, her executive demeanor returning as she engaged with the strategic analysis. But those are all expenses that don't directly generate revenue. They're investments that generate revenue over time, I corrected. The reason Sterling and Associates was profitable for 15 years wasn't because Kellerman was good at cutting costs. It was because he built systems that created value for clients and employees simultaneously. I returned to my chair and pulled out a folder containing analysis I'd been working on for weeks, but had never had the opportunity to share. Let me show you what a sustainable turnaround strategy would look like. Victoria leaned forward as I spread several documents across her desk. The first was a comprehensive client analysis showing retention rates, project satisfaction scores, and revenue per client over the past 3 years. Look at this pattern, I said, pointing to a graph that showed declining client retention under Victoria's management. We're completing projects faster and cheaper, but we're not getting repeat business. Clients are paying less per project and not recommending us to other organizations. But our profit margins per project have improved, Victoria pointed out. Short-term profit margins, yes, but total revenue is declining because we're not building relationships that generate ongoing work. We're becoming a commodity service provider rather than a trusted strategic partner. I showed her a second analysis comparing employee productivity metrics before and during her tenure as CEO. Employee productivity has increased in terms of billable hours, but it's decreased in terms of innovative solutions, client satisfaction, and knowledge retention. People are working harder, but not smarter. Victoria studied the data with the kind of focus I'd seen her apply to her own presentations, but this time she was asking questions rather than defending predetermined conclusions. What would you recommend? She asked. I pulled out a strategic plan I'd been developing since my third month at the company. It was comprehensive: 37 pages of analysis, recommendations, and implementation timelines that addressed everything from hiring practices to client relationship management. Phase 1 would focus on stabilizing employee retention, I began. We'd restore professional development budgets, implement performance-based compensation increases, and establish clear career advancement pathways. Not because we're trying to make people happy, but because employee stability directly correlates with client satisfaction and long-term profitability. Victoria was reading through the plan as I spoke, her expression growing more focused with each page. This would increase operational costs significantly in the short term. It would require investment, I agreed, but the ROI analysis shows break even within 18 months and substantial profit increases within 3 years. More importantly, it would rebuild the company's reputation as an employer of choice, which would improve our ability to recruit top talent and reduce the long-term costs associated with constant turnover. She turned to a section that detailed client relationship strategies. You're recommending that we turn down certain types of projects. I'm recommending that we focus on clients whose needs align with our core competencies and whose business models support long-term partnerships. Quick turnaround projects might generate immediate revenue, but they don't build the kind of relationships that sustain a consulting firm over decades. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, reading through the strategic plan with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she was taking it seriously. When she finally looked up, her expression was thoughtful rather than defensive. This is a completely different approach from what I've been implementing, she said. It's a different philosophy, I agreed. Your approach assumes that financial performance and employee satisfaction are competing priorities. This approach assumes they're complementary, that sustainable profitability requires creating an environment where talented people want to stay and do their best work. She closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. You've been planning this for months. I've been analyzing the company's needs for months, I corrected. The plan I've shown you represents what I believe would be most effective for Sterling and Associates specifically, based on its history, competitive position, and available resources. And you developed this analysis while working as my executive assistant. I developed it because I own 51% of this company, and I wanted to understand how to maximize the value of my investment, I said. Your success as CEO directly affects my financial returns and the company's long-term viability. Victoria was quiet again, and I could see her processing not just the strategic recommendations, but the fundamental shift in our relationship that my revelation had created. Why didn't you just fire me and implement these changes yourself? She asked finally. It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for weeks as I watched Victoria's decisions continue to damage the company's prospects. Because transformation is more effective when it comes from leadership that understands both the problems and the solutions, I said. If I'd revealed my ownership and replaced you immediately, the board and employees would have seen it as arbitrary change imposed by an unknown entity. If you can learn from this experience and lead the turnaround yourself, it creates institutional buy in and sustainable culture change. And if I can't learn from this experience, I met her gaze directly. Then I'll exercise my authority as majority shareholder to make necessary changes in company leadership. But I'd prefer to work with you rather than replace you, assuming you're willing to acknowledge that your current approach isn't working. Victoria picked up the strategic plan again, flipping through pages that detailed everything from revised hiring criteria to client communication protocols. When she reached the implementation timeline, she stopped and studied it carefully. This would require admitting to the board that my management strategy has been flawed, she said quietly. It would require acknowledging that the company's challenges are more complex than cost reduction and efficiency improvements, I said. It would mean shifting from crisis management to sustainable growth strategy. She nodded slowly, and I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Not just the financial implications of changing course, but the professional and personal risks of admitting that she'd been wrong about fundamental aspects of business leadership. I need time to think about this, she said finally. How much time? Give me until Monday morning. I want to review your analysis thoroughly and consider all the implications. I stood up and gathered my materials, leaving only the stock certificate and strategic plan on her desk. Victoria, there's one more thing you should know. She looked up expectantly. The board meeting today wasn't a coincidence. Margaret Chen has been asking questions about employee retention and client satisfaction for weeks. Sandra Park has been requesting detailed performance metrics that go beyond quarterly financial reports. They're already concerned about the company's direction. Today's discussion just brought those concerns into the open. Victoria's face went pale. They've lost confidence in my leadership. They're questioning whether the current strategy is sustainable, I said, which means you have an opportunity to regain their confidence by demonstrating that you can adapt your approach based on new information and changing circumstances. I walked toward the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. The choice is yours, Victoria. But either way, Sterling and Associates is going to change direction. The only question is whether you're going to lead that change or be replaced by someone who will. I left Victoria's office with the kind of deliberate calm that had served me well during combat operations in Afghanistan. The hallway seemed different now. Not because anything had physically changed, but because my relationship to this space had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer walking through someone else's building as an employee, hoping to remain invisible. I was moving through my own company as someone who finally had the authority to address the problems I'd been documenting for 8 months. Maya was still at the reception desk when I reached the lobby, organizing client files with the meticulous attention that had made her indispensable, despite being consistently underpaid and undervalued. She looked up as I approached, her expression curious. How did the board meeting go? She asked. Victoria seemed pretty tense when she came back. It was exactly the kind of question that illustrated why Maya was so valuable to the company's operations. She paid attention to details that others missed, noticed patterns in behavior that revealed underlying dynamics, and genuinely cared about the organization's well-being beyond her own immediate responsibilities. It was illuminating, I said, choosing my words carefully. There might be some significant changes coming. Maya's eyes brightened slightly. Good changes? I hope so, I said honestly. Changes that would make this a better place to work for people who care about doing quality work. She nodded, understanding the subtext. Maya had been at Sterling and Associates for 3 years, long enough to remember what the company culture had been like under Robert Kellerman's leadership, and observant enough to recognize how dramatically things had deteriorated under Victoria's management. I took the elevator down to the 12th floor where David was finishing up his afternoon analysis of quarterly projections. His cubicle was organized with military precision, a habit we'd both developed during our respective service experiences. And I could see multiple spreadsheets open on his monitors displaying financial data that looked considerably less optimistic than what Victoria had been presenting to the board. Hey, he said, looking up as I approached. How was your afternoon? Eventful, I said, settling into the guest chair beside his desk. What are you working on? David glanced around to make sure no one was within hearing distance, then leaned closer. Trying to reconcile the revenue projections Victoria requested with the actual client pipeline data. The numbers don't match, and I can't figure out where the discrepancy is coming from. I looked at his spreadsheets, recognizing immediately what he was seeing. Victoria had been requesting financial projections based on optimistic assumptions about client retention and project renewal rates that weren't supported by actual client communication patterns. What does the data show? I asked. We're going to be short on projected revenue by at least 30% next quarter, David said quietly. Maybe more, depending on whether Henderson Industries renews their consulting contract. But Victoria keeps asking for projections that assume everything is going according to plan. It was exactly the kind of disconnect I'd been observing for months. Victoria making strategic decisions based on what she wanted the numbers to show, rather than what they actually revealed. David was too professional to openly criticize his supervisor, but his frustration was evident in the way he kept adjusting his calculations as if he could somehow make the math work. Have you mentioned the discrepancy to her? I asked. I've tried, David said, but she keeps saying that the projections need to reflect our strategic goals rather than historical performance patterns. She seems to think that if we project success confidently enough, it will somehow materialize. I studied his analysis more carefully, seeing the same patterns I'd been documenting from my position as executive assistant. Victoria wasn't deliberately falsifying data, but she was consistently choosing to emphasize information that supported her preferred narrative while minimizing evidence that contradicted it. David, I said carefully, what would you do if you were running this company? He looked surprised by the question. Hypothetically? Hypothetically? David leaned back in his chair, considering the question with the kind of analytical approach that had made him valuable to every organization he'd worked for since leaving the Navy. First, I'd like to understand why our client retention has dropped so dramatically, he said. You can't fix revenue problems without understanding why customers are choosing not to continue working with you. I nodded, encouraging him to continue. Second, I'd look at employee productivity in terms of quality outcomes rather than just quantity metrics. We're producing more deliverables per person than we were a year ago, but client satisfaction scores have declined. That suggests we're prioritizing speed over quality, which is unsustainable in a consulting business. What else? I'd like to understand the real cost of employee turnover. Every time someone leaves, we lose institutional knowledge, client relationships, and the investment we made in training them. We're spending more on recruitment and orientation than we're saving on salaries. David was describing exactly the analysis I'd been conducting independently, confirming that the problems with Victoria's management approach were evident to anyone who looked at the data objectively. Have you shared these observations with Victoria? I asked. I've tried to bring up some of these points in team meetings, David said, but she's focused on operational efficiency metrics rather than strategic sustainability issues. She seems to think that if we can just reduce costs and increase productivity, everything else will fall into place. I was quiet for a moment, considering how much to tell David about what had happened in Victoria's office that afternoon. Our agreement to keep our relationship professional during work hours had been based on the assumption that I was just another employee navigating corporate dynamics. But my revelation to Victoria had fundamentally changed those dynamics. David, I said finally, there's something I need to tell you about my role here. He looked at me with the kind of attention that suggested he sensed the conversation was about to shift in an unexpected direction. I'm not just Victoria's executive assistant, I said. I own 51% of Sterling and Associates through a shell corporation called Mountain West Investment Group. David stared at me for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally a kind of recognition that suggested pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. You bought the company when Kellerman was selling, he said slowly. 18 months ago, I've been working as an executive assistant to understand how the company operates and evaluate Victoria's performance as CEO. David was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of what I'd told him. I could see him thinking through conversations we'd had, decisions Victoria had made, and patterns he'd observed over the past 8 months. That's why you've been asking so many strategic questions, he said finally. You haven't been curious about company operations as an employee. You've been evaluating them as an owner. Exactly it. And Victoria found out today. I told her after the board meeting. She's been treating me like irrelevant support staff while running my investment into the ground. David leaned forward, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications. What happens now? That depends on whether Victoria is capable of acknowledging that her current approach isn't working and accepting guidance on a sustainable turnaround strategy, I said. I've given her until Monday to decide whether she wants to lead necessary changes or be replaced by someone who will. And if she chooses to stay and change her approach, then we implement a comprehensive strategy that addresses employee retention, client relationship management, and long term profitability rather than just quarterly cost reduction. David nodded slowly. The kind of strategy that would address the issues I've been seeing in the financial data. Among other things, yes. He was quiet again, and I could see him considering not just the immediate implications for his own position, but the broader impact on Sterling and Associates' future direction. Sarah, he said finally, there's something you should know about what's been happening while you've been working upstairs. What do you mean? People have been talking. Not gossip exactly, but concerns about the company's direction. There's been a lot of discussion about whether Sterling and Associates is still a good place to build a career. I wasn't surprised, but I wanted to hear his perspective on the employee sentiment I'd been observing from my position as executive assistant. What kind of concerns? Job security mostly. Victoria's cost cutting measures have created an environment where people feel like they're constantly being evaluated for elimination rather than development. Good people are updating their resumes because they don't trust that the company will invest in their long term success. How many people are actively looking for other opportunities? David glanced around again, then spoke quietly. More than half the staff, probably, including some of our best performers who could easily find positions elsewhere. It was worse than I'd realized, and it confirmed that Victoria's management approach wasn't just affecting financial performance. It was creating an exodus of talent that would be extremely difficult to reverse. There's something else, David continued. Marcus in accounting has been asked to prepare some unusual financial summaries. Revenue breakdowns by employee, cost per project analysis, productivity metrics that look like they're designed to identify underperformers. I felt a chill of recognition. Preparation for additional layoffs. That's what it looks like. Victoria hasn't announced anything officially, but the data requests suggest she's planning another round of personnel cuts. The timeline suddenly became much more urgent. If Victoria was planning layoffs, it meant she was doubling down on cost reduction rather than considering alternative strategies. It also meant that more talented employees would leave voluntarily rather than wait to see if they'd be selected for elimination. David, I said, I need you to do something for me, but I need you to keep it confidential until Monday. What do you need? I want you to prepare a comprehensive analysis of what it would cost to retain our current staff versus what it would cost to replace them if they leave voluntarily. Include recruitment expenses, training costs, lost productivity during transition periods, and the impact on client relationships. David nodded, understanding immediately why this analysis would be valuable. You want to demonstrate that employee retention is more cost-effective than constant turnover. I want data that shows the real financial impact of treating employees as disposable resources rather than strategic assets. I can have that ready by Monday morning. Good. And David? Yeah? Thank you for telling me about the layoff preparations. That changes the timeline significantly. He studied my expression. You're going to stop her from eliminating more positions. I'm going to stop her from destroying this company one short-sighted decision at a time. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing everything I'd learned about Sterling and Associates over the past 8 months, but my mind kept returning to a conversation I'd had with my financial advisor, Marcus Chen, 3 weeks after starting my position as executive assistant. I'd called him because I was beginning to realize that my investment was in more serious trouble than the quarterly reports had indicated. Sarah, Marcus had said during that conversation, sometimes the best way to understand a failing business is to trace its problems back to their source. Financial distress is usually a symptom, not a cause. At the time, I'd thought he was talking about Robert Kellerman's strategic mistakes, the rapid expansion, the mismatched client portfolio, the unsustainable cost structure that had driven Sterling and Associates toward bankruptcy. But tonight, as I spread documents across my kitchen table, I realized there was another layer to the company's problems that I hadn't fully understood. I pulled out my laptop and opened the secure files I'd been maintaining since my first week at the company. Hidden within folders labeled with innocuous names like office supplies and meeting notes was a comprehensive database of every significant decision Victoria had made as CEO, along with documentation of the rationale she'd provided and the actual outcomes that had resulted. The pattern that emerged was troubling in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until now. Victoria wasn't just making bad strategic decisions, she was making decisions that consistently benefited her own career advancement while harming the company's long term prospects. I opened a file labeled Personnel Decisions and began reviewing the terminations and departures that had occurred under Victoria's leadership. On the surface, the employee exits looked like routine turnover in a company undergoing restructuring. But when I examined the details more carefully, a different picture emerged. Three of the most experienced senior consultants had been eliminated during Victoria's first quarter as CEO, ostensibly as part of cost reduction measures. But these weren't underperforming employees. They were individuals who had strong relationships with major clients and deep institutional knowledge about Sterling and Associates' core competencies. Their departure had directly contributed to the client retention problems David had identified in his financial analysis. More significantly, all three had been replaced by junior consultants who were less expensive to employ, but also less capable of managing complex client relationships independently. This created a dynamic where Victoria appeared to be the primary strategic decision maker for most major projects, which enhanced her profile with the board while undermining the company's operational capacity. I cross referenced the personnel changes with client satisfaction data and found correlations that were impossible to ignore. Projects that had previously been managed by experienced consultants with minimal oversight were now requiring Victoria's direct involvement, which she was presenting to the board as evidence of her hands on leadership style rather than acknowledging it as a consequence of eliminating qualified staff. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Coffee tomorrow morning? Julian." I stared at the message for a moment before remembering that Julian was Victoria's predecessor in the CEO position, someone who had worked at Sterling and Associates for 6 months before Victoria's arrival and had left under circumstances that were never clearly explained to the staff. I typed back, "Who is this?" The response came quickly, "Julian Martinez, former interim CEO. I have information about Victoria's hiring that you need to know." My breath caught. Julian Martinez, the same last name I'd been using as my cover identity at Sterling and Associates. It couldn't be a coincidence. I called the number immediately. "Sarah?" Julian's voice was cautious but familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. "Julian? How did you get my number?" "The same way I found out that Mountain West Investment Group is your shell corporation," he said. "I've been tracking the ownership changes at Sterling and Associates since I left. When I realized who the new majority shareholder was, I started paying closer attention to company developments." I was quiet for a moment, trying to process the implications of what he was telling me. "You know about my ownership?" "I know a lot of things that might surprise you," Julian said, "including why Victoria Sterling was really hired as CEO and what she's been reporting to certain board members privately." The weight in his voice suggested that whatever information he had wasn't going to be good news. "What do you mean? What she's been reporting privately?" "Meet me tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Pioneer Courthouse Square, Northeast Corner. There are things about Victoria's performance that go beyond bad management decisions." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone with a growing sense that the problems at Sterling and Associates were more complex than I'd realized. I spent the rest of the evening reviewing board meeting minutes and financial reports with new scrutiny, looking for patterns I might have missed. What I found was a trail of information that had been carefully curated to support specific narratives rather than provide comprehensive assessment of company performance. Victoria's quarterly reports to the board consistently emphasized metrics that showed improvement while minimizing or omitting data that revealed underlying problems. Employee turnover was presented as strategic workforce optimization. Declining client satisfaction was framed as transitional adjustment during operational improvements. Reduced revenue was explained as temporary market fluctuations, rather than acknowledged as a consequence of management decisions. But more troubling was what I found in the financial documentation. Victoria had been providing supplemental reports to individual board members, reports that weren't part of the official quarterly submissions and weren't shared with the full board. These supplemental reports contained more detailed analysis of specific operational areas, but they were customized for each recipient in ways that suggested Victoria was telling different board members different versions of the same story. Margaret Chen, whose background was in real estate development, received reports that emphasized Sterling and Associates' potential for expansion into new market segments. James Rodriguez, with his technology background, got analysis that focused on efficiency improvements and digital transformation opportunities. Dr. Warren, with her academic economics perspective, saw reports that highlighted cost reduction achievements and productivity metrics. Each board member was receiving information that aligned with their professional interests and expertise, but none of them were getting a complete picture of the company's actual performance across all operational areas. It was a sophisticated approach to information management that kept individual board members satisfied with Victoria's leadership while preventing them from seeing patterns that might raise questions about her strategic decisions. I opened my laptop and began composing an email to Marcus Chen, asking him to review the ownership documentation for Mountain West Investment Group and verify that all board members had complete access to shareholder communications. If Victoria was manipulating information flow to individual board members, it might constitute a violation of fiduciary responsibility that could provide grounds for immediate termination. But before I could send the email, my phone rang. The caller ID showed David's number. "Sarah, we have a problem," he said without preamble. "Victoria called an emergency staff meeting for tomorrow morning. She's announcing immediate personnel reductions, effective Monday." I felt my stomach drop. How many people? At least 12 positions, possibly more. She's eliminating the entire junior consultant tier and most of the administrative support staff. The timing wasn't coincidental. Victoria had clearly decided that her best response to my revelation was to accelerate her cost-cutting strategy rather than consider alternative approaches. "David, do you have the list of positions being eliminated?" "Not officially, but I've heard names. Maya in reception is definitely included. So are most of the people in client services and project coordination." I closed my eyes, thinking about Maya's genuine care for the company's well-being and her value as someone who understood both client needs and internal operations. Eliminating her position would save approximately $40,000 annually in salary and benefits, but would eliminate institutional knowledge and client relationship management that was worth far more than that to the company's long-term prospects. "Sarah," David continued, "there's something else." Victoria scheduled individual meetings with remaining staff for Monday afternoon. Word is that she's going to present this as necessary right-sizing, but also as an opportunity for advancement for people who demonstrate loyalty to her leadership. The implication was clear. Victoria was using the threat of additional layoffs to consolidate her authority and eliminate potential sources of resistance to her management approach. "Thank you for calling," I said. "This changes everything." "What are you going to do?" I looked at the documents spread across my kitchen table. Months of analysis and documentation that revealed the scope of Victoria's mismanagement. Then I looked at my phone, thinking about Julian's cryptic message and the suggestion that there were aspects of Victoria's hiring that I didn't understand. "I'm going to stop her," I said. I arrived at Pioneer Courthouse Square 15 minutes early, finding a bench near the northeast corner where I could observe the morning commuters while watching for Julian. Portland's downtown was coming alive with the familiar rhythm of a Friday morning. Coffee shops opening their doors, business people hurrying toward office buildings, street vendors setting up their carts for another day of urban commerce. At exactly 8 o'clock, a man in a dark wool coat approached my bench. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of careful alertness that suggested military background. When he sat down beside me, I could see the resemblance that had made my cover identity at Sterling and Associates more convincing than I'd realized. "You're actually my cousin," Julian said without preamble. "Your grandmother, Elena, was my grandfather's sister. When Marcus Chen told me that Sarah Martinez had acquired Sterling and Associates, I started looking into the family connections." I stared at him, processing the implications of what he was telling me. "Marcus knew about our relationship?" "Marcus has been handling investments for our family for over a decade," Julian said. "He's the one who suggested that your military background and business education would make you a good candidate for the Sterling acquisition. What he didn't tell you was that I'd already tried to save the company through conventional management approaches and failed." The pieces of a larger puzzle were starting to fall into place. "You were the interim CEO before Victoria. For 6 months. I tried everything you're probably thinking about now: employee retention strategies, client relationship rebuilding, operational efficiency improvements that didn't require eliminating people. None of it worked because the problems at Sterling and Associates go deeper than management decisions." Julian reached into his coat and pulled out a manila folder, setting it on the bench between us. "Victoria Sterling wasn't hired randomly. She was recruited specifically because of her track record with companies that needed to be prepared for acquisition." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What do you mean, prepared for acquisition?" "Robert Kellerman didn't just sell his majority stake to Mountain West Investment Group," Julian said. "He also signed an agreement with a private equity firm called Meridian Capital that gave them first right of refusal on any subsequent sale of the company. But the agreement only activates if Sterling and Associates can demonstrate consistent profitability for 18 consecutive months." I opened the folder and found documents that I'd never seen before, contracts and agreements that had been executed separately from the stock purchase I'd negotiated with Kellerman. The legal language was complex, but the implications were clear. If Sterling and Associates failed to meet specific financial benchmarks, Meridian Capital could force a sale at a predetermined price that was significantly below market value. Victoria was brought in by Meridian to ensure that the company would fail those benchmarks, Julian continued. Her job isn't to turn Sterling and Associates around. It's to create a paper trail of management decisions that would justify a forced sale to Meridian at a discount. I read through the agreement more carefully, noting clauses that seemed designed to trap any new owner in an impossible situation. The profitability requirements were calculated using metrics that emphasized short-term financial performance over sustainable business operations. The timeline for meeting those requirements was aggressive enough that any meaningful strategic changes would be difficult to implement and demonstrate within the allotted period. This explains why she's been so focused on quarterly numbers rather than long-term sustainability, I said, understanding finally why Victoria's management approach had seemed so disconnected from sustainable business principles. "It also explains why she's been providing different information to different board members," Julian said. "She needs to maintain enough board support to prevent a challenge to her authority, but she also needs to ensure that the company's performance metrics fall short of the Meridian Agreement requirements." I felt a surge of anger that was unlike anything I'd experienced since returning from Afghanistan. I'd been manipulated not just as an employee, but as an investor. The dismissive treatment, the undermining of my suggestions, the systematic destruction of company culture, all of it had been deliberately designed to ensure that my investment would fail. "How long have you known about this?" I asked. "I started putting it together after I left Sterling and Associates," Julian said. I couldn't understand why Victoria was making decisions that were obviously harmful to the company's long-term prospects. When I researched her background more thoroughly, I found connections to Meridian Capital that weren't disclosed during her hiring process. "What kind of connections?" Julian flipped to another section of the folder, revealing a series of financial documents that showed consulting payments from Meridian Capital to Sterling Consulting Group, a company owned entirely by Victoria Sterling. She's been receiving compensation from Meridian throughout her tenure as CEO of Sterling and Associates, Julian said. Officially, it's payment for strategic consulting on potential acquisition targets. Unofficially, it's payment for ensuring that Sterling and Associates becomes an attractive acquisition target at below market prices. I studied the financial records, noting that Victoria's consulting payments from Meridian had increased each quarter as Sterling and Associates' performance had declined. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental. This is fraud, I said quietly. It's worse than fraud, Julian replied. It's a systematic scheme to manipulate company performance for the benefit of outside investors at the expense of shareholders, employees, and clients. I closed the folder and looked out at the square, where people were going about their normal Friday morning routines, unaware that their livelihoods were being manipulated by financial engineering they'd never heard of. Why didn't you expose this when you discovered it? I asked. Julian was quiet for a moment, and I could see something that looked like regret cross his face. Because I didn't have proof that would hold up in court, and because challenging Meridian Capital directly would have required resources I didn't have. They're not just a private equity firm. They're connected to political and financial networks that can destroy careers and reputations. But now I have majority ownership, which gives you legal standing to challenge the Meridian agreement in court, Julian agreed. But only if you can demonstrate that Victoria's management decisions were deliberately designed to harm the company rather than improve its performance. I thought about the 8 months of documentation I'd been compiling, the comprehensive analysis of employee turnover and client retention problems, the evidence of strategic decisions that prioritized appearances over sustainable operations. I have that documentation, I said. Julian turned toward me with an expression of surprise mixed with hope. How comprehensive is it? 8 months of detailed records covering every significant management decision, along with analysis of outcomes and alternative approaches that weren't implemented, I said. Plus, financial data that shows the correlation between Victoria's decisions and declining company performance. That might be enough, Julian said slowly, especially combined with the evidence of her financial relationship with Meridian Capital. I stood up from the bench, feeling the familiar sense of clarity that had served me well during military operations when complex situations suddenly resolved into clear objectives and actionable plans. Julian, I said, I need you to help me prepare a comprehensive legal challenge to the Meridian Agreement. I also need you to document everything you know about Victoria's recruitment and her ongoing relationship with Meridian Capital. What's your timeline? Victoria's announcing layoffs this morning that will eliminate 12 positions, including some of our most valuable employees. The staff meeting is in 2 hours, and individual termination meetings are scheduled for Monday afternoon. Julian's expression grew grim. She's accelerating the timeline. If she eliminates that many positions at once, it will create operational chaos that could justify forced sale to Meridian. Not if I stop her first? How? I picked up the folder containing evidence of Victoria's fraudulent relationship with Meridian Capital, feeling the weight of 8 months of preparation and a lifetime of training in strategic planning under pressure. I'm going to walk into that staff meeting and exercise my authority as majority shareholder, I said. Victoria Sterling is about to discover what happens when you try to manipulate someone who owns 51% of your playground. Julian smiled for the first time since our conversation had begun. I'll prepare the legal documentation for challenging the Meridian Agreement. You focus on saving the company. Deal. As I walked away from Pioneer Courthouse Square towards Sterling and Associates, I felt the familiar combination of nervous energy and focused determination that had carried me through combat operations in Afghanistan. The stakes were different, but the principles were the same. Gather intelligence, develop strategy, execute with precision, and never let the enemy dictate the terms of engagement. Victoria Sterling was about to learn that she'd chosen the wrong target for her manipulation. I entered the Sterling and Associates building at 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes before Victoria's scheduled all-hands meeting. The lobby felt different this morning. There was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to vibrate through conversations and hurried footsteps. Maya looked up from her desk as I passed, her usually bright smile replaced by the kind of forced cheerfulness that people wear when they're trying not to think about bad news. Morning, Sarah, she said, but her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there yesterday. Victoria asked me to make sure everyone knows the meeting is mandatory. How are you doing, Maya? I asked, stopping at her desk despite the urgency I felt to get upstairs. Her smile faltered slightly. Honestly, I'm scared. There are rumors about layoffs, and I can't afford to lose this job. I've got student loans and my mom's medical bills, and she trailed off, clearly not wanting to burden me with personal details. I felt a surge of protective anger toward this young woman who worked harder than anyone else in the building and treated every client interaction like it mattered personally to her. The idea that Victoria would eliminate Maya's position to save money while collecting payments from Meridian Capital made my hands clench involuntarily. Maya, I said quietly, whatever happens in that meeting, don't sign anything today. If they ask you to sign termination papers or accept severance packages, tell them you need time to review the documents with a lawyer. Her eyes widened slightly. Do you know something? I know that hasty decisions made under pressure usually benefit the people creating the pressure more than the people feeling it, I said. Just remember, you have value here that goes far beyond what any spreadsheet can calculate. I took the elevator to the 15th floor, where the executive conference room was already filling with employees who looked like they were attending a funeral rather than a company meeting. David was seated near the back, his notebook open, but his expression grim. The junior consultants clustered together in the middle rows, their usual professional confidence replaced by the kind of alertness that comes from sensing danger. Victoria entered the room at exactly 10 o'clock, carrying herself with a kind of rigid authority that suggested she was preparing for battle. She wore a navy blue suit that looked like armor, and her hair was pulled back severely enough to emphasize the sharp angles of her face. Behind her walked Robert Fisher, the board's legal counsel, whose presence at a staff meeting was unusual enough to confirm that something significant was about to happen. Good morning, everyone, Victoria began, her voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. I've called this meeting to discuss important strategic changes that will position Sterling and Associates for sustainable growth in an increasingly competitive market. The corporate doublespeak was immediate and obvious. Strategic changes instead of layoffs, sustainable growth instead of cost cutting, competitive market instead of acknowledging management failures. I felt the familiar combination of anger and tactical awareness that had served me well during military operations when enemy forces tried to disguise their true intentions. Victoria clicked to her first slide, which displayed a graph showing projected cost savings over the next 6 months. After careful analysis of our operational efficiency metrics, we've identified opportunities to streamline our workforce and optimize resource allocation. I watched the faces around the room as the euphemisms continued. These were intelligent people who understood exactly what Victoria was saying beneath the corporate language. Maya's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. The junior consultants were exchanging glances that suggested they'd already suspected this was coming. David was taking notes, but his expression indicated he was documenting the meeting rather than accepting its premises. Effective Monday morning, Victoria continued, we will be implementing workforce adjustments that will affect 12 positions across multiple departments. These changes reflect our commitment to operational excellence and financial sustainability. She clicked to the next slide, which listed the departments that would be affected: reception and client services, junior consulting staff, administrative support, and project coordination. It was a carefully calculated list that would eliminate the people who provided day-to-day operational support while preserving the senior positions that reported directly to Victoria. Individuals whose positions are being eliminated will receive severance packages that exceed industry standard, Victoria said, along with professional references and outplacement assistance to support their career transitions. The silence in the room was deafening. People were processing not just the fact that they were losing their jobs, but the realization that their colleagues were being eliminated in what felt like a calculated purge rather than a strategic business decision. That's when I stood up. The movement was deliberate and controlled, designed to draw attention without appearing confrontational. Every eye in the room turned toward me, including Victoria's, whose expression shifted from confident authority to something that looked like panic. Victoria, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the conference room, Before you continue with these announcements, there's something the staff needs to know about the decision making process behind these workforce adjustments. Victoria's face went pale. Sarah, this isn't the appropriate time for. Actually, hey, I interrupted, keeping my voice level and professional. This is exactly the appropriate time. Because what you're announcing today isn't a strategic business decision designed to improve company performance. It's part of a deliberate strategy to manipulate Sterling and Associates' financial metrics for the benefit of outside investors. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Robert Fisher leaned forward in his chair, his legal instincts clearly sensing that something significant was happening. David's pen had stopped moving entirely, and he was staring at me with an expression of recognition and growing understanding. Victoria tried to regain control. Sarah, you're out of line. These decisions have been made after careful consideration of. Of what? I asked, walking toward the front of the room with the kind of calm purposefulness that had been drilled into me during leadership training. How to ensure that Sterling and Associates fails to meet the profitability requirements in your agreement with Meridian Capital. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria's mouth opened and closed without sound, while Robert Fisher sat up straight with the kind of alertness that suggested his legal mind was rapidly processing implications. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the folder Julian had given me that morning, setting it on the conference table where everyone could see it. What you haven't been told, I continued, addressing the room rather than Victoria specifically, is that these layoffs aren't designed to save Sterling and Associates. They're designed to ensure that the company fails to meet performance benchmarks that would trigger a forced sale to a private equity firm at below market prices. Maya's hand went to her mouth. David was writing furiously now, documenting everything he was hearing. The junior consultants were looking between Victoria and me like spectators at a tennis match where the stakes had suddenly become life-changing. Victoria found her voice, but it came out higher and less controlled than her usual executive tone. These are serious accusations that is supported by comprehensive documentation, I said, opening the folder to reveal the financial records showing Victoria's consulting payments from Meridian Capital, including evidence that you've been receiving compensation from the same private equity firm that stands to benefit from Sterling and Associates' failure. Robert Fisher stood up abruptly. Victoria, I think we need to discuss this privately. But I wasn't finished. I looked around the room at the faces of people whose livelihoods were being manipulated by financial engineering they'd never consented to participate in. There's one more thing everyone needs to know, I said. The reason I have access to this information, and the reason I have the authority to challenge these decisions, is that I'm not just Victoria's executive assistant. I pulled out the stock certificate I'd shown Victoria the day before, holding it up so the room could see the official seals and signatures. I'm the majority shareholder of Sterling and Associates. I own 51% of this company through Mountain West Investment Group. Which means, I said, turning to look directly at Victoria, that you work for me, and you're fired. The room exploded into chaos, excited conversations, shocked exclamations, and the sound of Robert Fisher's chair scraping against the floor as he stood up and began speaking rapidly into his phone. But through it all, I felt the profound calm that comes from finally being able to act with complete authority to protect something worth protecting. The conference room erupted into a cacophony of voices, some shocked, some confused, some asking rapid-fire questions that overlapped and echoed off the walls. Maya had her hand pressed to her chest like she was trying to steady her heartbeat. David was staring at me with a mixture of awe and recognition, finally understanding why I'd been asking such pointed questions about company operations for months. Victoria remained frozen at the front of the room, her presentation remote still clutched in her hand, her carefully constructed corporate facade crumbling in real time. Robert Fisher was speaking urgently into his phone, probably calling other board members or legal counsel, his voice a low murmur against the background noise of 30 employees trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Everyone, please, I said, raising my voice enough to cut through the chaos without shouting. I know this is a lot to absorb, but I need you to listen carefully because what happens next will affect all of you. The room gradually quieted, though I could see people whispering to each other and stealing glances between Victoria and me like they were trying to understand which of us actually had authority in this moment. First, I continued, the layoffs that Victoria announced are canceled, effective immediately. No one is losing their job today, Monday, or any time in the foreseeable future. The termination meetings scheduled for this afternoon are not happening. I heard Maya let out a small sob of relief. Several of the junior consultants were smiling for the first time since entering the room. But I could also see confusion on faces throughout the audience. People trying to understand how someone they'd known as executive assistant suddenly had the power to override CEO decisions. Second, I said, I want to be completely transparent about what's been happening at Sterling and Associates and what's going to change going forward. For the past 8 months, I've been working as Victoria's assistant while conducting a comprehensive evaluation of company operations, management decisions, and strategic direction. David was nodding slowly, pieces of conversations and observations finally making sense to him. That's why you always knew so much about the financial data, he said quietly, but loud enough for people nearby to hear. Exactly. I've been documenting everything, not to spy on anyone or to build a case against individual employees, but to understand why a company with talented people and loyal clients was struggling to maintain profitability and employee retention. Victoria finally found her voice, though it sounded strained and desperate. This is highly irregular. You can't simply walk into a staff meeting and announce management changes without proper board approval and actually I can, I said calmly, pulling out my phone and opening the email I'd received from Margaret Chen at 6:47 that morning. Because the board voted unanimously this morning to accept your resignation and authorize me to assume operational control pending a comprehensive review of company policies and strategic direction. Robert Fisher ended his phone call and approached the conference table, his expression serious but not hostile. Sarah, I've just spoken with Margaret Chen and Dr. Warren. They've confirmed the board's emergency session this morning and their decision to support your authority as majority shareholder. The room fell silent again as the full implications sank in. Victoria wasn't just being challenged by a subordinate employee, she was being removed by the board of directors based on evidence of misconduct that went far beyond poor management decisions. How long have you known? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How long have you been planning this? I've known about your relationship with Meridian Capital since this morning, I said honestly. I've been documenting your management decisions since my second week here, but I only discovered the financial manipulation last night. I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. I want everyone to understand that what's happened here isn't about personal conflicts or management style differences. It's about protecting this company and your jobs from deliberate sabotage by people who stood to profit from our failure. Marcus from accounting raised his hand tentatively. What does this mean for our day-to-day work? Are there going to be more changes in management? It was exactly the kind of practical question I'd been hoping someone would ask. Evidence that people were thinking beyond the drama of Victoria's removal toward the actual implications for their professional lives. Excellent question, I said. In the short term, very little changes in your daily responsibilities. Projects continue, client relationships are maintained, and everyone keeps doing the work you've been doing. What changes is that decisions about company direction will now prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term cost cutting. I walked over to the whiteboard and began drawing a simple organizational chart. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to implement a new management structure that gives department heads more autonomy and decision-making authority. Maya, you'll be promoted to Client Relations Manager with responsibility for coordinating between reception and client services. David, you'll become Director of Financial Analysis with authority to provide strategic recommendations directly to senior leadership. Maya looked like she might cry again, but this time from relief and excitement rather than fear. David was already taking notes, his analytical mind clearly engaging with the possibilities of expanded responsibility. The junior consultants will have opportunities to take on more complex projects with appropriate support and mentorship, I continued. Professional development budgets will be restored, performance-based compensation increases will be implemented, and we'll establish clear career advancement pathways. One of the junior consultants, Jennifer, raised her hand. What about client relationships? Some of our clients have been working primarily with Victoria. How do we maintain those relationships during the transition? Another excellent question that demonstrated people were thinking strategically about business continuity rather than just celebrating Victoria's departure. Jennifer, that's going to be one of your primary responsibilities, I said. You'll be working with Maya and David to conduct a comprehensive review of all client relationships, identify any concerns or issues that need immediate attention, and develop transition plans that ensure continuity of service. I could see energy and engagement returning to faces around the room. People who had been demoralized by months of cost cutting and uncertainty were suddenly seeing opportunities for growth and advancement. Victoria had been standing silently during this exchange, but now she spoke up with something that sounded like desperation. You can't just dismiss me without proper documentation and severance negotiations. There are legal protocols that the weight of that statement settled over the room like a blanket. People were beginning to understand that what they'd witnessed wasn't just a corporate power struggle, it was the exposure of fraud that could have destroyed their company and eliminated their jobs permanently. I want everyone to know, I said, addressing the room but looking directly at Victoria, that Sterling and Associates is going to survive and thrive. The deliberate sabotage stops today. The respect for employees starts today. The focus on sustainable growth and client satisfaction starts today. I moved toward the door, then turned back to face the group. Take the rest of the day to process what you've heard, enjoy your weekend, and come back Monday ready to build something worth being proud of. As people began filing out of the conference room, talking excitedly among themselves, Victoria remained standing at the front like someone who couldn't quite process what had just happened to her carefully constructed world. But I wasn't finished with her yet. The conference room emptied gradually, with employees filing out in small groups, their conversations a mixture of excitement, relief, and curiosity about what would happen next. Maya stopped by my chair on her way out, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, she said simply. I don't know how you did this, but thank you. David lingered near the back of the room, clearly wanting to speak with me, but respectful of the fact that I still had business to finish with Victoria. Robert Fisher was organizing papers at the conference table, his legal mind already working through the procedural requirements for the transition in leadership. When the last of the employees had left, Victoria finally moved from her position at the front of the room. She walked slowly toward the conference table, her earlier confidence replaced by something that looked like shell shock. 18 months, she said quietly, settling into a chair across from me. You've been planning this for 18 months. I've been protecting my investment for 18 months, I corrected. The planning only started when I realized that my investment was being deliberately sabotaged by someone I was paying to protect it. Victoria stared down at her hands, which were trembling slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. You don't understand the pressure I was under. Meridian Capital didn't just offer me consulting fees, they threatened to destroy my career if I didn't cooperate with their acquisition strategy. It was the first honest thing she'd said since I'd revealed my ownership of the company, and I could hear genuine fear beneath the words. Tell me about the pressure, I said, not offering sympathy, but not dismissing her explanation either. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal versus how much to protect herself legally. Robert Fisher looked up from his papers, his attention focused on our conversation with the kind of intensity that suggested he was documenting everything for potential legal proceedings. Meridian identified Sterling and Associates as an acquisition target before Robert Kellerman ever decided to sell, Victoria began. They approached me 6 months before your purchase went through, asking me to provide strategic consulting on companies in financial distress. It seemed like legitimate work, analyzing operational inefficiencies, identifying cost reduction opportunities, evaluating management structures. I nodded, encouraging her to continue without indicating whether I believed her version of events. When they offered me the CEO position here, they presented it as an opportunity to implement the turnaround strategies I'd been developing through the consulting work. They said Mountain West Investment Group was a passive investor who wanted professional management to handle day-to-day operations. And you believed that? I asked. Victoria's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. I wanted to believe it. The CEO position at Sterling and Associates was a significant step up from the consulting contracts I'd been working on. The salary was excellent, the company had a solid reputation, and the turnaround challenge seemed manageable. When did you realize there was more to Meridian's involvement? Robert Fisher asked, his legal training making him focus on timeline and intent. About 3 months into my tenure here, Victoria admitted, I started receiving very specific guidance from Meridian about which cost reduction measures to prioritize and which performance metrics to emphasize in board reports. When I questioned some of their recommendations, they reminded me about the consulting fees I was still receiving and suggested that my success at Sterling and Associates was directly tied to my ability to follow their strategic guidance. I felt a mixture of anger and something that might have been sympathy. Victoria had clearly been manipulated by people who understood how to exploit professional ambition and financial pressure, but she'd also made choices that had harmed innocent people who depended on Sterling and Associates for their livelihoods. What did they tell you about the endgame? I asked. Victoria was quiet again, and I could see her calculating how much honesty might help her situation versus how much it might make things worse. They said that if Sterling and Associates failed to meet the profitability benchmarks in the Meridian agreement, they would acquire the company at a discounted price, and I would be offered a senior position in their portfolio management division, she said finally. It would have been a substantial promotion with significantly higher compensation. So you were incentivized to ensure that the company failed, Robert Fisher said, his voice carrying the kind of cold disapproval that suggested he was thinking about criminal liability rather than just employment issues. I was incentivized to focus on short-term financial improvements that would look good in quarterly reports while positioning the company for eventual acquisition, Bint, Victoria said, but her explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Portland skyline while processing what Victoria had told me. The view was the same one I'd been seeing for 8 months, but today it felt different, like territory that had been contested and was finally secure. Victoria, I said without turning around, do you understand what you've cost this company beyond the financial losses? She didn't answer immediately, and when I turned back toward her, I could see that she was struggling with the question. I know that employee morale has suffered, she said carefully. Employee morale? I repeated. Maya was working a second job on weekends to pay her student loans because you eliminated the professional development budget that would have qualified her for a promotion. David was updating his resume because he couldn't see a future here under your management. Jennifer in consulting was considering leaving the industry entirely because she thought the toxic environment here was representative of professional consulting. Victoria's face had gone pale again, and I could see that she was beginning to understand the human cost of her strategic decisions. These aren't just employees or line items on financial report, I continued. They're people who chose to invest their careers in Sterling and Associates because they believed in what this company could accomplish. Your manipulation didn't just threaten my financial investment, it threatened their professional futures and personal security. The room was quiet except for the sound of Robert Fisher's pen moving across his legal pad. Victoria sat motionless, staring at the conference table like she was seeing it clearly for the first time. What happens to me now? She asked finally. Robert Fisher looked up from his notes. That depends on several factors, including your willingness to cooperate with investigations into Meridian Capital's acquisition scheme and your ability to provide documentation of their communications and instructions. If you cooperate fully, Robert, I added, and if you provide testimony that helps us challenge the Meridian Agreement in court, we might be able to structure your departure in a way that protects you from criminal liability while ensuring that you can't harm other companies in the future. Victoria nodded slowly. What do you need from me? I pulled out a legal pad and began writing a list of specific documentation and information that would be necessary to build a comprehensive case against Meridian Capital's manipulation scheme. Every email, every phone call, every document they provided, every instruction they gave you about Sterling and Associates operations, I said, plus a detailed timeline of your interactions with them from initial contact through this morning. And if I provide all of that, then you walk away from this with a severance package, professional references that acknowledge your cooperation, and legal protection from prosecution related to the Meridian scheme, Robert Fisher said. But you also sign agreements that prevent you from working in executive positions at companies that might be vulnerable to similar manipulation. Victoria was quiet for a long time, weighing her options against consequences that could extend far beyond losing her job at Sterling and Associates. "I'll do it," she said finally. "I'll provide everything you need to stop Meridian from doing this to other companies." And for the first time since I'd walked into that staff meeting, I felt like the real battle was finally over. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where everything had changed, but this time I was addressing a very different audience. Sterling and Associates had not only survived the Meridian Capital scheme, we'd thrived. Employee retention was at 93%, client satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, and we just signed our largest contract in company history. Maya walked in carrying a folder marked Meridian Capital Settlement, with a smile that could have powered the entire building. The legal battle had ended with Meridian paying substantial damages and facing federal investigation for securities fraud. Victoria's cooperation had been instrumental in exposing similar schemes at 12 other companies across the region. "The final paperwork came through this morning," Maya announced, setting the folder on the table. "Meridian's acquisition rights have been permanently terminated, and the settlement funds will fully capitalize our employee profit sharing program." David looked up from his laptop, where he was reviewing quarterly projections that showed Sterling and Associates exceeding all performance benchmarks by significant margins. "Also," he added with a grin, "Forbes wants to interview you about veteran entrepreneurship and corporate fraud prevention." I thought about that morning 8 months ago when I'd walked into this building as Sarah Martinez, executive assistant, carrying coffee and hoping to remain invisible. Now I was Sarah Elena Martinez Kellerman, CEO of a company that had become a case study in how to rebuild corporate culture and sustainable profitability simultaneously. Sometimes I said, looking around the room at people who'd become not just employees, but partners in something worth building, the best revenge is simply refusing to let them win. Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was working against you? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences might help someone else who's facing similar challenges. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel. There are more stories of people who refused to stay down when life tried to bury them.